Joining us, we have Dr. Janet Browne. She's a distinguished historian of biology who has written extensively on the subject. Among her writings is the widely acclaimed two-volume biography of the naturalist Charles Darwin. The latter volume, Charles Darwin, The Power of Place, has received several awards, including the James Tait Black Award for Nonfiction in 2004, the W.H. Heinemann Prize from the Royal Literary Society, and the Pfizer Prize from the History of Science Society. She's the first woman to be the president of both the British Society for History of Science and the History of Science Society. In recognition of her significant contributions to biographical knowledge related to Charles Darwin, she was honored with the Honorary Doctor of Science degree from Trinity College, Dublin in 2009. She taught the Wellcome Trust Center for the History of Medicine, University of London College. She has recently retired from teaching at Harvard University. Dr. Browne, your wealth of knowledge, wisdom, and accomplishments surpass the scope of this brief introduction. Thank you so much for joining Community today. Would you start by providing us with some insights into your educational and professional journey that has paved the way for where you are now?
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. And of course, I'd be delighted to talk about my education. I'm English, as you perhaps can tell from my accent. So I was brought up in England. I only moved to the United States in 2006. So I was educated at a girls' private school where I feel that their commitment to both the sciences and the arts made it a very good education because I wasn't distracted in any way. So I had some marvelous science teachers who were also women. We were all women, apart from one man who taught classics. So I was educated in England. I took the English exams and was quite bright. I passed them all very well. There was a time when I wanted to go to university in the United States, but my father in those days thought that wasn't such a good idea. I was a bit too young to go and live on my own in the United States. So I went to university in Ireland, in Dublin, which I simply loved, a 4-year program. And afterwards, I took a science degree in Trinity Dublin, zoology. After that, it was a bit difficult to know what to do. This was 1972, which of course is 1,000 years ago. There wasn't much for women to do in the sciences. I could have been a laboratory technician, but that seemed as dull as heck. I could have perhaps joined some kind of environmental agency. They have them in England, just like they do in the United States, but that didn't seem terribly interesting either. So I, excuse me, decided I would take a master's 1-year course in something that I'd not heard of before called History of Science. It's well known about now, but in those days it was a little unusual. We all know about history of art, and we all know about history, but it was quite unusual to have courses and degrees in history of science. And that's where I had a revelation that the areas of research that I really enjoyed, the biological sciences, had a history. I had no idea that they had a history and that you could spend ages sitting in a library reading about that history, writing essays and having a wonderful time. So I did my master's and decided that I would then like to do a PhD. And I'm sure that many of the young people that you're associating with understand that it's important, if you're going to make a mark, to have these higher degrees. It was certainly important when I was younger. Perhaps it's less important now, but to have the PhD, the graduate training, really makes a difference. In England, graduate training isn't so long. It only takes 3 years. So by the time I was 30, I had a degree, I had a husband, I had a little house, I had a cat, and I wanted to go to America because I hadn't been able to do that earlier on. So I came to Harvard for a one-year postdoc in 1979, and that was just terrific. I loved that, and it transformed me and what I thought I might be able to do with my life, because I hadn't met so many people who were interested in the same sorts of things as me, who were bright and exciting and talkative. So that 1 year as a postdoc really set me on the course of becoming an academic. And then, if we're going to go through my whole life story, it was difficult to find a regular job. As I went back to England, I had masses of things that I thought about and could talk about. I hadn't got much teaching experience. I picked up a job as a junior lecturer in a medical history of medicine charity body called the Wellcome Trust. It's a big medical charity that has a section that teaches history of medicine. So I joined that and found that history of biology was really quite important for teaching history of medicine. And I spent some years also, that was just a part-time job, and I'll get on to why they're all part-time and a bit insecure. I also got a job in Cambridge, England, not Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the university library, working in a team that was editing all Charles Darwin's letters. And that was a terrific job to have as a young married woman with a child. I could run around the library looking things up. I didn't have to bring the work home. And editorial work is often thought to be something that women do rather well. And I certainly did do it rather well. So that was a useful thing to have, and I simply loved it. I loved working with the original documents, the letters that Darwin wrote, his handwriting, and getting to know his family, this is 150 years ago, getting to know all his friends, hearing him write about his own children, his babies, his dogs, and the very intricate questions about natural selection that he also wanted to have his friends or his correspondents answer for him. So this was a tremendous further training, working intimately with manuscripts in a library on a project that was publishing them all. So I felt as a young woman, and it's probably much worse in the past than it is now, that there were no regular jobs for academic women. So when I wanted to become a teacher in a university environment, I was only offered a temporary part-time position, and I was just as good as any of the other people who had full-time, well-paid positions, but I was only offered a part-time position. So I was very lucky to be able to pick up another job, which was the one working on Darwin's correspondence. And yet that was a job that is not always thought of as being fully academic. It was an editorial position. And I think a lot of my 30s and my 40s were spent in establishing an academic reputation, although I was, whilst not quite working in the academic realm. And a number of my friends had the same kind of situation. I think it's different now. I hope it's different now. But I felt at the time that I was picking up jobs that I was lucky to get, and that I had to stick with them and make a reputation by writing and researching on my own, in my own time, and publishing in my own time. So that's my story.
Well, thank you for sharing that. So it sounds like for you, it was a lot of trying to gain recognition for your academic work outside of your academic position in this editorial position, right? And writing about Darwin's life.
Yes. So I don't want to make it sound as if I was writing copy for fast food stalls or anything. It was a pretty academic
Yes, of course.
editorial position, and my expertise was valued. The expertise of everybody on that team was very highly valued. And my expertise was valued as a teacher in the history of medicine as well. And that gave me my sense of self so that I could go to conferences, deliver papers, talk to people, and have an identity, which is very important as an academic. But it wasn't a conventional identity. I wasn't an assistant professor and then an associate professor and then a professor. It went differently for me.
Okay.
I wasn't a professor until I came to America.
Was there a specific reason for that? Was it just at that point in your life you were now, had the credits to be a professor, as you say? Or do you think there was a difference moving to America in the recognition that you had in your work?
There was very definitely a difference in moving to America. I had worked very hard for 15 years writing the biography about Darwin that you mentioned in your introduction. Excuse me. And that took a lot of work, very expert, and was produced beautifully by my publishers and sold extremely well and won prizes. So that was astonishing. I was thrilled to bits. I had no idea it would take off as well as it did. And I had no idea that I might get some prizes. But when I did, gosh, I was happy. And that made a tremendous difference to me personally. And of course, to the people who asked me to come and speak at meetings, and to the academic community when I went round giving talks. And it's because of that volume, those volumes, that when Harvard was looking for a new professor in the history of biology, that they happened upon me. They obviously looked at lots of people and interviewed lots of people and had several people in mind, including me. But it was me that they chose in the end. And they chose me because of that Darwin book. And I was a good choice for them because I've done a lot for them since then. But it was the Darwin book that gave me the stature that Harvard professors need to have before they're appointed.
Thank you for sharing that. So going back to the beginning of your career, or at least sort of your interest in history of science, you said that you'd taken a course in university, correct? I guess when did you decide that you wanted to pursue a career in STEM and specifically within that realm of STEM?
So I did a lot of science at school. I liked science a lot, except for organic chemistry. And I specialized in order to go to university, you have to, in Britain, you have to say what it is you want to do. And I wanted to do zoology, animals studies. So it wasn't really biology. I just did animals. But the university I went to insisted that you learnt all the sciences in a kind of pyramid, and that you only did your specialism at the top in your senior year, which is what I did. And I graduated with a zoology degree and a lot of knowledge that I picked up on the way with genetics and microbiology and geology and all the other things that I was made to do that I just loved. So I was absolutely happy being a scientist. I think it's a wonderful thing. I wouldn't want to be an organic chemist, but that's just me. If I had this skill set for organic chemistry, of course, I would be delighted to do it. But I enjoyed zoology very much from a girl right through my university training. So when I moved into history of biology, I wasn't giving up biology. I was simply expanding my knowledge back into the past and finding out through other people's books and through my own research how the ideas that we know about today came into being. So it was super interesting. So I had to keep up with what was going on today, read Science and a couple of other magazines. I didn't really like Nature very much, that magazine called Nature, but of course you look for the jobs in the back. But Science was very good, and Scientific American was very good for somebody like me. And really became very engaged with wanting to know not so much about why women aren't in the sciences so much as wanting to know how the sciences had come to be what they are today. They're so important. They dominate everything in our lives. It's not an unpleasant domination, but it's so important in the environmental issues. All the things that we worry about today are based in biology. How has that happened? That's what we try and ask. And so I'm very interested in, you're perhaps not looking at the STEAM aspects of your study because you're looking at STEM subjects. But if you think about the arts as applied to understanding the sciences, understanding how the sciences have happened the way they happen, that's what engages me, the STEAM aspect of your interview.
Thank you for sharing that. It is definitely important. I thank you for bringing up the A in STEAM, because I think art is inherently a part of sciences, and I love art, and I do that in my free time. And so finding that amalgamation between STEM and arts and basically STEAM is very important. So was history sort of a secondary subject that you looked into once you realized there is something such as history of science, and it was a better way to understand what you were already looking into?
Yes, indeed. A better way for me,
Mhm.
had I been a top-notch geneticist, I might have stuck with genetics like some of my friends did. But I really liked the history. I really liked being in an old library with lots of old books. And I really enjoyed reading Darwin's letters, other people's letters, and making a story out of them. So I liked the storytelling aspect of history as well. I liked the way that history or historical research can bring things to light that we don't really think about much today. So I had, or perhaps we do think about them today quite a bit more than we used to. I had a lot of interest in women in science in the past. So what had it taken women to contribute to science when it was all masculine, when all the journals were just full of men writing things, and you couldn't, if you sent an article in to be published, you wouldn't use your first name, you just use your initials. in the Victorian period, for example. So I looked a lot at Victorian women, 19th century women, and how they were able, or not able, as the case may be, to contribute to science. They mostly did it through natural history, through biology.
Was this before your work in learning more about Darwin's biography, or was this simultaneous with
It's simultaneous, but I've done more since then. So my biography was published in 1993 and 2002. So since then, of course, I've had plenty of time to do extra work, and I'm very keen on thinking about the women in science. It's very important.
that? So you mentioned that you love the environment of being in a library and being surrounded by these books that you could delve into the history of science with. Could you expand more about what you love about your profession, and then also what were some of the hardest parts related to your work?
What I love most about my profession is the sense of community, so that even though you're sitting in a library, you're not talking to anybody else. You are looking at the things that you've got in front of you. And then, if you're lucky, there's a cafe or something where you can go to afterwards, and you can say to somebody who may or may not be a historian, you can say, "You'll never guess what I've just read." So the sense of talking about what you're finding is intellectually very important, because it helps you formulate what it is you're trying to do. And then somebody might not be very interested and carries on drinking their coffee, or they might say, "Wow." So the feedback of a community is something I've always very much appreciated. And our little community of historians of science is very friendly. We don't stab each other in the back. We're not all fighting for the one postdoc in microbiological science. We're quite interested in what happened in the past. So it's a bit recondite. It's a bit obscure when you say to somebody, "Well, I was looking at what Caroline Herschel did the other day." So she was from the 1700s, or the 1800s, and they're interested, it's kind of fun.
So, I know I've mentioned this before and you've talked about it, but you have released plenty of books on the life of Darwin, and that has received a lot of acclaim and awards. Was that, do you think, one of the highlights of your career? And was that like in a moment where you felt like you had a project that significantly influenced a field or felt very impactful?
Oh, thank you for mentioning it that way. It was a tremendous effort for me to write that book. It took forever. I was never satisfied with it. I kept reading it through and going back and changing things. Made it as perfect as I could. So it was, of course, a great relief to publish it. And then I was stunned at the response. And it definitely was the major turning point in my life. There's no question about it. It is something that it lived with me for the 10 or 12 years that I was writing it. And then it's lived with me since it was published, because I'm now the person who wrote it. And I'm proud of it. It transformed my academic life and my prospects as well. I've never been particularly ambitious, but it meant that I could think in ways that I hadn't really thought before. It meant that when Harvard said, "Would you like to come and have an interview?" that I could say, "Yeah, yes, I could," which I wouldn't have done before. It gave me confidence. I had produced something that people admired. I'd won some prizes. It was very important for me. But I have to say, I'm sorry if this is going on a bit. I didn't begin writing it thinking I want to make an impact. But I did make an impact, and I was ever so pleased to do that.
So, was this a moment in your career where, up until that point, you were very well established, or you were getting to that point and might have been undermined in different positions? And once that book came out and you got that acclaim, you had more of the confidence to say, yes, I am very well proficient in this field, and I know I am, and now I've been recognized for that and can apply for these positions or be asked to join these positions with such confidence. Is that correct?
That is exactly correct. Yes, I think you put that admirably. I felt that, of course, I thought I was perfectly competent all the time through, but presumably I was not always perceived that way by my colleagues, because several people said to me afterwards, after I had published this book, they said, wow, I didn't know you had that in you. So it certainly changed the way that I was seen, and it changed the way I thought about myself. So I think if young women have one or two or three things that they really feel are important, they should go ahead with them and see what happens.
Yes, throughout this journey and throughout your career, was there any mentorship or support networks that played a significant role in your career, or just getting you where you are? Anyone that either it could be a teacher who really supported you in the class, or throughout writing these biographies, someone who really encouraged you or motivated you, pushed you on?
Oh, well, thank you for that question. I've had a number of very wonderful friends and mentors over the years. They've changed, obviously, as people have grown up or moved, or some cases have died. I had a marvelous professor who taught me when I did my master's class, who didn't know anything about Darwin, but was very, very thoughtful and supportive. So that was truly nice. They thought of me as an extra daughter, which was also very nice indeed. I had a marvelous friend who had a very fertile, happy nature. And she, if I was depressed or fed up with something, or it wasn't working so well, I would go and see her, and she'd not talk about that, but she'd talk about something completely different. And so that was marvelous as well. And I had a husband who was terrific. So yes, we all need support. We all need our friends, and we all need circumstances that allow you to call on people if you need them. And I'm a very community-based person. I very much like to live and work in an institution, in a community. So I valued my friends very much. Yes.
So moving on more to sort of the goals of STEMunity and increasing visibility of women in STEM, could you share more of your experience on representation of women in STEM throughout your career, and sort of what the impact of diversity and inclusion sort of has on
Hmm.
innovation and progression in STEAM?
In my own special part of academic life, within the history of science discipline, I think it's been tremendously interesting to see that the department that I joined, well, I went to Harvard as a postdoc in 1979, and the teachers there, the professors there, were all men, all very nice, no question about that, very talented. And the junior teachers were women, all very nice and all very talented. So there was a typical structure of the past was men at the top and women doing all the helpful things at the bottom. That was 1979. When I came back in 2006, there were, of course, still male professors in the department, but the department gradually became all female. All the senior people, all the clever top dogs in the department were women. So it was just wonderful to see that happen. We were, I think, the only department at Harvard to be only women for a while. And so that was very pleasing. Now, that's a rather specialized case. I've seen women become more and more important in the administration of the academic profession. I've seen women become more and more important in the societies that are so important for participating in science. I go to the AAAS meetings sometimes, and I see women all over the place being strong and powerful and marvelous. So this is terrific. And it didn't used to be like that. It really didn't. I haven't had anything influential, or I haven't done anything influential to make that happen, but I've seen it. I'm seeing it happen.
That's great to hear. So you would say that there has been a progression of more women stepping into these roles of power that mostly was dominated by men in the academic field. And that's great that women are the ones making this change and recognizing the need for this change. What are the steps that you think institutions and organizations can take to create a more inclusive environment and a more supportive environment for women in STEM and STEAM?
Well, they are asking themselves that very question. So when we think about someone as brilliant as Jennifer Doudna, who came up with the CRISPR, what kind of support has she had? She had to plug away in labs. She didn't always get the grants that she needed to have the lab that she needed. I think the difficulties are at the postdoctoral level, really, after grad school, when you're trying to get into a niche, you have to choose which area of the sciences you're going to specialize in, and that's very niche, you know, which microorganism or which sodium pump you're going to work on. And I believe that it's at that point that there's less opportunities, less funding, less understanding about people's family lives and the needs of, let's say, a couple who are living in separate cities across the United States, things like that. For women in their 40s, when they're trying to become superstars, it's very difficult. It's much easier for a man in his 40s to become a superstar. And I'm not quite sure how the organizations and societies could change that, except by perhaps having grants or awards or positions that are expressly for women. But you can't do that because that's not fair. That's not equality. So I just don't know what they can do more than what they're doing. But I am seeing changes. I really am.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So definitely you're saying at a postdoctoral level, if there was more recognition and also funding in terms of grants for projects that women are leading, that would help in creating a more inclusive environment, or at least an environment where women are being supported for their careers in STEAM.
Yes, I think so. I think it's terribly important as well that there are women who are leading a lab, so that they are often a little more supportive in many ways of young women who come into their lab, and they need nurturing and mentoring. Although a good lab director will do that for anybody, but it's particularly nice if your lab director is a woman, I have found.
Could you expand on that? So do you think that your female connections or the women that you've reached out to in your STEM career or sort of mentored you has definitely helped in sort of progressing that career or sort of giving you the motivation to keep going? Sorry if I'm not phrasing that completely well.
Now, I know what you're meaning. It's going back a long time, but yes, one of the older women who was my professor when I did history of science as a PhD was enormously helpful. And she would say, "Have you met so-and-so?" And I'd say, "No." And she'd say, "Oh, let's ask him in for a talk." And so there were all kinds of little ways in which well, it's not a particularly female trait to be concerned and interested and mentoring, but the person I had as my female director of studies was very concerned and nurturing and mentoring in that way. So I felt it made a difference for me. And I've tried to do that for my students all the time, male and female. But I'd like to put a little more focus on the females.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that. So you're a storyteller, and now you're also sharing your story with the wider community. Could you share more about how you think sharing personal experiences can benefit and inspire future generations, and especially young women looking at their STEAM careers?
Oh, well, I've no idea how that could possibly help. I suppose hearing other people's path against minor and sometimes major adversities is helpful, but it's not for a current graduate student to hear of my own path isn't terribly helpful, is it really? What they want is to have a structure that will move them through a life without having to cope too much with adversity. And I don't think we've quite got that structure. If you are a young woman wanting to be an academic historian, there's obviously a progression. You have a PhD, you have a postdoc, you get a junior professorship, or you maybe have to get a second postdoc. And the junior professorship, you have to write your book before you're promoted to an associate professorship, and on and on. There is a structure. It's just that it's a structure that has so many terrible moments in it that I think it's very hard for young people to handle it. That's where you need mentors. You need someone to hold your hand through this. It's a wonderful profession. There's nothing better in the world than teaching other people. And people want to do it. But sometimes the structure tends to make it too hard, and you decide to leave. And of course, the money is frightful. So you might leave to go and work in a bank or whatever. That you have a life to live. You can't always hang on for that next grant.
What guidance would you offer those watching this interview and sort of in that position of getting through the structure, but still want to aspire and pursue their career in STEM?
Oh, keep at it. Really? It's I kept at it, and I'm basically a very cheerful, upbeat kind of person, but goodness me, there are some moments when it can be very, very dispiriting. And there are times when you are asked to leave a position or something like that, and it just can get too much. So I would advise anyone to really go for it. But then if it looks as if it's not going to work for you, don't let it undermine your self-confidence, because there are lots of things that you can do, and it doesn't all have to be academic. So I have a daughter who was very academically inclined and took a PhD in classics, Roman and Greek history, and decided she didn't want to be an academic, and she's working for an NGO doing something very socially useful. And it's so much better, really. So there's no reason, if the academic world is not working for you in the way that you want it to work, you are a very talented person and you can do lots of things, is my advice.
Thank you for sharing that advice, and thank you so much for sharing all of the wisdom and experiences and anecdotes in this interview and joining us today.
It's been a great pleasure. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful project put together.